Today, I'm attempting to build a custom furniture piece with a design detail that changes everything, while making a really big mistake that almost changed everything. A client of mine requested that I build a floating console to add to their foyer. I had already built a bench with curved corners for them, and because of that, this piece needed to have a curved element as well to kind of bring the room together per se. So I initially designed a piece that would have round corners using the same radius as the bench, but something on this design was bothering me a little bit. The drawers were somewhat too narrow and they had flat drawer fronts, and I thought, what if I extended the drawer and the drawer fronts to the edges of the piece and make the fronts follow the curvature of the top? Well, I loved that, and so did the designer and the client. That, of course, posed a challenge for me because I had never built curved drawer front like this before, but for me, that's what really makes woodworking fun. After milling my white oak boards for the top and the bottom of the cabinet, I decided to use some dominoes for alignment. They really are not necessary, but I just wanted an extra assurance that they would align well, since the milling process didn't leave much extra thickness to take down if the boards weren't aligned after the glue up. But honestly, anything you want to use for glue up, dominoes, dowels, biscuits, it really helps just reduce anxiety and assure that you're going to have a good product at the end. So I think it's worth the time investment. With my top and bottom auto clamps, I ran them both on my drum sander to help clean up the glue squeeze and fine tune it to the exact 3/4 inch thickness that I needed. I definitely could have run them through my planer, but I was having some pesky snipe issues and I didn't want to risk it. And then I ripped both sides of the top and the bottom on my table saw to ensure that they're right width and that the two boards of each panel look exactly the same width. Then it was time to start on my cabinet sides. I milled up an 8/4 Rift-On white oak board for that. I thought that was important because later on I was going to shape them to follow the curvature of the top, and the straighter the grain, the less risk of tear outs I would have. Because this board was wider than 8 inches, which is the capacity of my jointer, I used my bandsaw to rip it down to about 8 inches and then used my jointer to face join it and edge join it. I forgot to record, but I also took this board through my planer to get two parallel faces in the right thickness and ripped it on my table saw and then finished prepping the boards by getting them to the right height using my crosscut sled. I always like to leave boards as large as possible until right before joinery time so I can trim it to the exact dimensions later on. You might be wondering why I'm gluing up two short vertical pieces like this versus just using one longer board for the sides and dividers. The reason is that if I had them laying sideways with seasons, the overall height of the cabinet would change, which would mess up with the reviews for the drawer fronts. Having them move front to back doesn't create an issue because the drawer slides are made with oblong holes exactly to account for that variation. That is another reason why I used rifts on here versus flats on. The amount of movement across this small width is practically zero. Plus, the vertical grain would make it almost impossible to see the glue up seam, so it's kind of a double insurance policy. Speaking of insurance policy, I want to thank... I was just kidding. This video is sponsored by myself, and I have really enjoyed making this, but it is a pretty significant investment of time. So my only ask is that you like this video if you're learning something from it, and if you're enjoying watching it, please just hit that subscribe button. That will help me keep making more content just like this. As I said before, I like to leave all panels a little extra sized in order to trim them to final dimension just before joinery, and that's what I'm doing here on my crosscut sled. Next, I inspected all of my pieces and started marking where I wanted the top, the bottom, the outside, the front, and the back, as well as the locations for the dominoes. It's a really great practice to do that. It not only helps in the glue up, but I think it potentially saves you from cutting joinery in the wrong places and ruining a piece you spent hours working on. Ask me how I know. Now it was joinery time for the cabinet. For the sides, I'm using my domino, which is held vertically by this Ramon Valdez domino docking station, which unfortunately you can't see very well in this shot, but I'll leave a link in case you want to check it out. In conjunction with this blue TSO Bigfoot attachment, which serves as a perfect base extension to hold the piece exactly where I need it to be. I could have just secured the piece to my workbench, but I find that for small pieces like this, it's really awkward to find a perfect holding device that's stable and it's not on the way. The other benefit is that you have a pretty accurate and repetitive solution using the Domino Little Stopper stab thingy. Hashtag not sponsored, by the way. Then I cut the mortises on the top piece of the box, again just using the domino tabs. That little thing allows me to use the tighter setting in the machine because I know the precision that's built in will create a near perfect joint. By the way, you're probably noticing that there's quite a big of a space between the last domino and the front of the cabinet, and the reason why is because I'm going to be shaping that to a curve, and the last thing I want is to have a domino appear when I'm removing material. Now it was time to cut the bottom panel off the box so that it fits perfectly in between the two sides, as you can see here. In order to do that, after cutting a clean and square edge, I used a scrap piece of the same thickness of the bottom panel, perfectly aligned to the internal edge of the left side of the cabinet, just enough to raise the cabinet to fit the bottom panel and mark exactly where I needed to make the second cut. I learned never to rely on measurements when it comes to this. Using the actual piece as a reference eliminates any potential errors that might have accumulated throughout the build to this point. And that strategy really paid off, as you can see. The bottom piece fit perfectly. And what's a build with the Domino DF700 without the patented hip thrust from my friend Jason? I think he'd be proud of me. And thankfully everything fits super well in the dry fit. Okay, now we're going to transform this somewhat boring rectangular shape into a sexy rounded cabinet. The first thing I did was to trace a 3¼ inch template on top of the cabinet using a marker. The objective is to know where I needed to remove the bulk of the material before I fine-tuned it to its final shape. Then I traced the same template at the bottom of the piece using some 48-inch clamps to keep the sides in place. With my jigsaw, I removed the excess material from the top, following just outside of the line I had just made, making sure I didn't cross it. Then I repositioned the template on the top with a double-sided tape and used my trim router with a flush trim bit to fine-tune that corner to make sure it's perfect. Next, I needed to start shaping the sides of the cabinet, so I replaced the top and traced the corner shape into the end grain of the side pieces. Took everything apart and traced a line that was tangential to the outside of the curve with my 45-degree square, and you're gonna see why in a second. Okay, it was more than a second, but the reason why is because I wanted to cut the excess material from the side pieces using my table saw, and the angle of the blade was at 45 degrees. I just needed to align the line that I just made to the edge of the blade, and I knew I was going to cut it perfectly. Then I moved the fence to the other side of the blade to cut the rest of it. It was just a tiny bit piece, but I wanted to make sure that I had the least material possible to shape it by hand later on. And then there was just a little bit left, which I took off using my tenoning jig, angling the blade to meet the outside of that line, and I cut the rest. Then I put everything back together and used this humongous bits and bits compression pattern router bit to transfer the curvature of the top to the top of the sides. Then I flipped the piece around, put the template back in there, and routed the same profile from the bottom of the side piece. That way I would have the side piece with a profile that is absolutely perfect and the bottom at the top, and then I can just meet them in the middle. And if you wonder how I did that, I used the combination of my electrical hand plane with my 5.5 bench plane and my block plane. That enabled me to get very, very close to the line. And that's where my greed almost ruined all the progress I'd made so far. The reason why is because I had decided to use the sander with this soft pad to round the corners to make it perfect, but I realized right here that I actually ended up rounding those edges, which would completely ruin the reviews. So I took a breather and realized that I shouldn't have gone all the way through the sander, should have just stopped short of the sander and wait until I had the drawer front in place and I could round both the fronts and the sides together with the sander, but I still needed to do something with the messed up side. But before I tell you what I did, I needed to switch gears for a moment and start milling the drawer fronts. You might be confused now, but you'll see why in a few moments. To do that, I resawed and milled another 8/4 sawn board. I wanted to resaw it because I think it would create a nice book match effect, which allows for the grain to flow perfectly from the left to the right. So I think it's all in the details, right? After I milled the drawer fronts, I took them to my assembly bench to transfer their exact width to the bottom panel of the cabinet. That is, so I could trim that panel down in order for the fronts to fit perfectly at the bottom. Okay, now back to the side rounding problem. I think I came up with a solution that not only solves that problem, but also created a design feature that makes the overall solution better. If I cut a rabbet on the side piece, removing a full section from top to bottom, I would be able to square that side off again. Then I realized if I do that, I can extend the drawer fronts another 1/4 inch, which would also cover the gap where you would otherwise see a little bit of the drawer hardware, which you can see here on the original design. The final solution, I think it was a lot more elegant, making the reviews look great all around. So what I did is I marked where the bottom piece intersects with the side and then set the table saw fence so that the inside of the dado blade aligns to that line. And then use the setup block to set the height of the blades to a 1/4 inch, which is how much I wanted the drawer fronts to overlay. And success. The sides now are perfectly square with the edges again. Crisis averted. I then did the same thing on the other side. Very nice. The center dividers would be put together in place with a stopped dado that would go across the top and the bottom. So here I'm measuring both sides together to make sure I didn't have any mistakes in alignment when I put it back together. To cut the dados, I used my router with a track saw guide with a stopped to make sure that I had, a stopped dado. Of course, because the router bit was a 3/4 round bit, I had to come back with a chisel to square that off to make sure that the notched part of the dividers fit there perfectly. Then I put the dividers in there to make sure that it fits correctly, and I took a measurement between the edge of the cabinet and where the dividers are so that I could cut the notch. I also took the time to mark which side goes where because even though the dados were cut very closely to each other, the tiny little bit of difference between the left and the right side could make the dividers not fit flush with the bottom of the cabinet. I used the Cat's Moses magnetic guide and my Dozuki saw to cut the notch and then clean it up with the chisel. And thankfully, it fits perfectly. Then I added a 3/32 rabbet on where the edge of the side meets the top to create a visual separation, and then also follow the reviews that I would have for the drawer fronts as well. Next, I needed to add a panel to the back of the center open shelf. I needed to leave a space in the back for the French cleat piece I'd add there, so I needed to reduce the depth of the center dividers. Then I built a board that I was going to use as the backer piece and put it in place in order to take the correct measurements for the width between the two outside faces of the dividers. After confirming the back piece was the correct size, I cut some dominoes on both the backer piece and the back of the dividers. I had a gut feeling here that I was doing something wrong, but this was the end of the day and I was tired, not thinking too clearly. And I guess you can imagine that I'll get back to this really soon, and you're right. But as you're gonna see, I tested everything, it fit perfectly, so I thought I'm okay. And I moved on into pre-sanding the internal sides of the cabinet before gluing up. You're also gonna notice that I added some green tape in order to not sand these parts and mess up with the reviews once I glue it up. I also took the time to address some of the imperfections in the surface, which in this case I used black CA glue and accelerator, and then cleaned everything up with the random orbital sander. And then it was glue up time. After adding some green tape to protect where the panels meet from glue squeeze and make my life a little easier later, I started by adding glue and dominoes to the center back panel. I then clamped the back panel front to back and also added a couple of clamps to secure the center dividers in place. After it was dried, I removed the clamps and started gluing up the sides to the bottom cabinet. After adding glue and dominoes, I used the contraption from Bessie that adds two parallel clamps together to extend its reach since the cabinet was 49 inches long. Then I applied glue to the tops of the center dividers and side pieces and clamped everything top to bottom with two of those deep reach F-style clamps on top of each divider and three parallel clamps per side. Glue ups are often a bit stressful, but this one went on pretty stress-free, thankfully. Then I took it off clamps, and remember when I had a bad feeling about those dominoes in the back? Check this out. Here, I just want to give an update on something I did off camera. I realized I made a mistake when I glued up this back piece in here initially. You noticed in the video that I used dominoes to lock this in place, but when I took it off clamps after glue up, I realized there was a big gap on one of the sides, so obviously I needed to fix that. And the other piece as well is I realized that because it was fixed in there after the dominoes, that this piece here, if it moved with seasons, which it will, then it would create some problems because it was completely locked in there. So what I did to fix the situation is I was able to actually do some routing to actually remove it out of here. And I built another back, same dimensions, but now I fixed it with screws. And so the bottom screws are fixed in there, but the top screws have a little room for the wood to be able to move it correctly. As it often happens, the solution to a mistake turns out to be better than the original design, and it was true here as well. The screws allowed me to remove the back panel when needed. Right now, I needed to access the back edge of the center dividers as clamping surface to secure the drawer fronts in place to start shaping them to the final size. The process is very similar to the one I used to shape the sides of the cabinet. First, I positioned the drawer front buttoned up against the rabbet I cut and marked where I needed to remove the excess material using the top as reference. For the bottom, I used the original 3¼ inch template positioned and secured with a double-sided tape. And here you can see the whole picture of what needed to be removed from the drawer fronts. Then it was as simple as removing the bulk of the material using my tenoning jig with an angled blade on my table saw. I'm sure you're noticing a pattern, but the process is very similar than the process I used to shape the sides. I clamped the front back in place and used the top as a template to route the top of the drawer fronts and the plywood template to do the same from the bottom. Then it was hand plane time again to meet the two routed profiles in the middle, of course not making sure to leave a little material for the sander to remove later on. Here I had a little tear out, which I fixed with CA glue and accelerator. My finger almost got stuck in there. I put some tape in there to protect that area. I was gonna sand that later anyways. And now, finally, I could use the random orbital sander as I wanted to from the beginning to finish shaping the sides with the drawer fronts. I used this foam pad to help maintain the curvature of the piece. The result was super satisfying. The last part I needed to do in this build before finishing are the drawer boxes. There's a ton of videos on the interwebs on how to build drawers, so I'm gonna fly through this part and focus a bit more on the parts I did differently for this build. But let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a focused video just on drawers and my process in detail. For hardwood drawers, I typically use 5/8 of an inch thick material. I also try to use a more stable bottom, be it plywood or a shop veneered MDF. In this case, I'm using a white oak, a 1/4 inch plywood, which in reality is about 3/16 of an inch that I laminated together to make a 3/8 of an inch bottom. This is probably overkill, but when I use plywood, I try to glue up pieces where the grain direction overlaps to neutralize any potential movement. I mostly use rabbets as a construction method to ensure that no end grain is visible on the sides, while increasing glue surface to improve strength. And because I'm using bloom undermount drawers, I know that for 5/8 inch drawers, I needed to leave about 3/16 on each side, which as you can see here was perfect. After pre-finishing and gluing them up, all that was left to do was to cut a couple of notches at the back of the drawer, install the orange clips that connect with the rails, and install the drawer slides in the cabinet. And then tested everything and a very satisfying soft close action there. Oh, and I almost forgot, I also added these Miller dowels on the sides to increase the strength in the drawers. Typically, they add a little design detail, but in this case, this was less important, and you'll see why very soon. Well, it seems like I lied about the drawer fronts being the last piece before finish. I still needed to fit the drawer fronts. To do that, I used some double-sided tape, carefully pulled the drawers out, added some clamps, and screwed them in with some countersunk holes. Right now, the drawers fronts are oversized, and that's something I always try to do in custom pieces like this. This way, I can cut the final sizes and reveals to be as close as possible to perfect. So, I first needed to make a mark where I needed to cut it lengthwise, which I did using my crosscut sled. Then it was time for the reveals to be marked and cut as well. I'm using a 3/32 setup block to mark the top of the fronts on one side, and using a marking knife to mark where the side little rabbet detail meets the front. That would give me 2 points that I can join and cut on my crosscut sled. You might be asking, why didn't you make a 3/32 line across the whole top instead? And I'm glad you asked. It's because even if the cabinet wasn't absolutely square, or the rabbet wasn't dead on 3/32, I would still get a consistent 3/32 review across the top when all was done. And I, for some reason, didn't record this, but I also marked a 3/32 line from top to bottom and cut it on the crosscut slide. Then I put it all back together and was really happy with the results. Since this was a floating console, I'm using French cleats to hang it to the wall. For that, I'm ripping two pieces at 45 degrees. One will be attached to the cabinet using pocket holes, and the other piece, which needs to be slightly shorter to make it easier to feed and assemble later, would be attached to the wall using bolts through the studs. Okay, now we're ready for the finish process. I sanded everything starting at 80 grit and then moved to 120 and then 150. I always like to run a raking light to ensure that the surface is perfect with no swirl marks. I didn't record this, but I also used a block plane to create a very light chamfer on all edges. And I don't know about you, but when the project gets to this point, I often find myself just pausing and admiring the work so far. Mostly thankful to be able to engage in an activity that enables me to transform something rough and raw into a beautiful object, and knowing that even though I'm partly responsible for it, the beauty in the material does most of it. And you may find ironic that I'm applying a black finish after talking about the beauty of the material, but in my view, these two things are not contradictory. This piece needed to be black to match the bench I had made for this client, so I'm using Ruby Monocoat Precolor Easy Black, which you can see me applying here. I always use this white applicator in big surfaces and make sure to always keep a wet edge to ensure that there are no lap lines. And here's why I said the Miller dowels wouldn't offer a design detail in this case. You can't really see them since the drawers would also be black. Then I let it dry overnight and applied Rubio Oil Plus to Seed Charcoal, which is the darkest oil Rubio offers, and it really seals the black in case some of the stain rubbed off. The summary is I apply a small quantity, rub it well with the wide applicator, and let it absorb for 10-15 minutes, and then make sure to remove as much as possible with a rag. You can never really remove too much here. I find that whenever I use this type of finish, I end up revealing more of the texture of the grain than if I used natural oil. And I do think this is one of the main features that white oak or even ash offers. So, there, the beauty of the material, honored in a very noble way, in my opinion. Just look at it. I think it's beautiful. And there you have it. This piece was complete. I was absolutely in love with it when I was done. I think the round corners, the slight reveal between the top and the sides, combined with the drawer fronts following the curvature, the soft closing drawers, the beautiful finish, they all made this be one of my favorite pieces to date. The client and the designer loved it as well, which was always reaffirming. I would love to know what you think of it in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.